Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Mad Max series with Mad Max Fury Road. Now, Fury Road came out in 2015 and is co-written and directed by George Miller, and this is the fourth film in the Mad Max series, and the film acts as both a sequel and a reboot to the Mad Max franchise. Now, before I get on to the actual review, I want to quickly apologize for a fuck-up that I made in my Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome review. Now, in that review, I said this. This is the third film in the Mad Max series, and for the longest time this was actually the final film in the Mad Max series until Mad Max Fury Road came out 20 years later. Now, I meant to say 30 years later, but for some reason the number 20 was in my head, so I said Mad Max Fury Road came out 20 years after Beyond Thunderdome, which was a fuck-up on my part, and it wasn't until after I uploaded my Beyond Thunderdome review that I noticed my complete and total fuck-up, and I'm kicking myself over that, so you people don't have to. Now, when Beyond Thunderdome came out in 1985, I believe it was actually a really big hit, which is why it's actually kind of a surprise that they waited 30 years to make a Mad Max 4. Now, I believe in the early 2000s, they were actually going to make a Mad Max 4, and I believe Mel Gibson was going to reprise his role as the character of Max Rokitansky in this Mad Max 4 that never happened, but for some reason that never happened, and I know in like 2009 they were going to do an animated Mad Max movie, but for some reason that never happened either. I heard there was even a point where they were going to make a prequel to Mad Max, which would really be about how society became the way it was in the first three Mad Max movies, but that prequel idea never happened. There was even a point where they were actually going to do a remake or a reboot to Mad Max called Mad Maxine, where they were going to make Max a female character, but that never happened either. But after all these other ideas for a fourth Mad Max movie bit the dust, they finally made this movie. Now, as I said, this movie can count as both a sequel and a reboot to the Mad Max franchise. The reason I say that is because if you wanted to, you could set this in the same continuity as the first three movies, or you could just assume that this is a pure reboot set in its own continuity. Really, it doesn't matter. It really depends on whether you view this film as being canon with the rest of the franchise or not, so depending on how you look at this movie, it's both a sequel and a reboot. Now, throughout the film, there are scenes where Max sees the ghost of this little girl. Now, you're not really sure who this little girl is supposed to be. It appears that this little girl may be the ghost of Max's daughter, but in the first Mad Max movie, Max had a son, not a daughter, who was killed. Now, assuming that this film is set in the same continuity as the first three movies, you could assume that maybe in between the events of this movie and Beyond Thunderdome, maybe Max met a woman and they had a child and then this child got killed, or maybe this is a little girl that Max adopted in between movies and then got killed, or you could look at this little girl as just being a representation of all the people that Max failed to save. But that's just assuming that this film is set in the same universe as the first three movies. But if you view this film as being just a pure reboot, then you could just assume that in this continuity, Max had a daughter instead of a son. Now, there's actually a fan theory that might actually explain the little girl, and this fan theory might also explain a plot hole that's in the film but I'll talk about this plot hole in a little bit, and I'll explain what this fan theory is later on in this review. But I normally don't put too much stake in fan theories because a lot of them could get really ridiculous, but this fan theory I might actually agree with. Now, I loved the crap out of Mad Max Fury Road. Like, I freaking adored this movie. Now, if you remember, at the end of last year, 2015, I did a top 11 video of my top 11 favorite films of 2015, and this was actually number 1 on the list. Like, this was my favorite film to come out last year. But yeah, I really loved this movie, and when this was out in theaters, I actually saw this 3 times in the theater. Like, I loved the hell out of this movie, and honestly, I recommend this movie even if you've never seen the first 3 movies, because even though this is the 4th film in the franchise, you could easily watch this film as a standalone post-apocalyptic movie. And I want to say that both this and The Road Warrior are my 2 favorite films in this franchise. Now, this film was actually nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and it won 6. Now, I think this film definitely deserved a lot of its Academy Award nominations, and a lot of the wins as well. Like, I know this film won for Best Production Design and Best Costume Design, and it definitely deserved the Academy Awards for those things, and also the film was nominated, or George Miller was nominated, for Best Director, and I have to say that I think he definitely deserved it, because this is a very well-made film, and George Miller's talents as a director definitely show in this movie. Now, do I think the film deserved a Best Picture nomination? That might have been going a little too far. I mean, granted, this was my favorite film of 2015, but did it really deserve the Best Picture nod? That's kind of hard to say. I mean, it did have a lot of deeper meaning in it, but I'm not sure if it really deserved the Best Picture nod, and I know I'm kind of contradicting myself by saying that, because once again, this was my favorite film of last year, but I'm not 100% sure if it really deserved the Best Picture nod or not. But I remember when I was watching this past Academy Awards, George Miller looked like he was freaking having the time of his life at the Academy Awards. Now, some people have accused this movie of just being a mindless action movie, and yes, the film is basically just a giant-ass action sequence, but I really don't think it's a mindless movie at all. Like, I actually do think this film has a lot of deeper themes in it, and also has a lot of social commentary in it. Like, there are definitely a lot of feminist themes within this film, and this film also seems to have kind of a commentary on gender issues. The film also seems to have some commentary on things like religion and hero worship. This film also seems to have kind of an environmental theme as well, because in this movie you find out that one of the things that led to the collapse of civilization, besides the fact that the world was running out of oil, was in this movie you find out that the world was also running out of water. Now, in real life, because of climate change, there are a lot of places in the world right now that are suffering droughts, and you could almost look at this movie as kind of reflecting what's actually going on. So, in a way, like, the same way the old Mad Max movies were playing into a lot of people's fears and anxieties of nuclear war, because the old ones came out during the time of the Cold War, this one is kind of playing into people's concerns of climate change. But while the film does have a lot of social commentary in it, I don't think any of it's really shoved in your face. Or at least, in my opinion, it's not shoved in your face. Like, it's definitely there, but I don't think any of it's really shoved down your throat. Now, in this movie, Tom Hardy plays the character of Max. Now, Max, of course, was played by Mel Gibson in the old movies, but in this film, Tom Hardy does a brilliant job as Max. Like, I really thought he did an excellent job playing this character. In the film, Charlize Theron plays the character of Furiosa, and she does a great job in this movie, and I freaking love Charlize Theron, and she does an amazing job in this film as the character of Furiosa. Another really good performance in this movie is Nicholas Hoult as the character of Nux. Now, in the film, Hugh Keays-Byrne plays the main villain in Morton Joe. Now, Hugh Keays-Byrne also played the character of Toe Cutter in the original Mad Max. First of all, I want to apologize for the dramatic change in lighting. I recorded the first part of this review last night, and then I got tired and went to bed, so now I'm recording the rest of the review. Now, the first Mad Max movie was really about the breakdown of society. In the first movie, you realized that something was happening which was causing society to break down, but in the first movie, you really weren't sure what exactly that was. In The Road Warrior, you found out that what was causing society to break down was the fact that the world was running out of oil, so society was starting to collapse, and the first movie was really about the breakdown of society. In The Road Warrior, society officially collapsed, and also it was implied between the events of Mad Max and The Road Warrior, there may have actually have been a nuclear war. In the third Mad Max movie, Beyond Thunderdome, it's pretty much confirmed that it was a nuclear war that happened between the events of Mad Max and The Road Warrior. Now, assuming that this film is canon with the rest of the series, then also in this movie you find out that the world was also running out of water, so that was another thing that contributed to the collapse of human civilization. Now, the plot of this movie is it follows the character of Max, who has actually gone kinda crazy, and he's having visions of this little girl who might be the ghost of a little girl that he knew, or this might just be a representation of all the people that he failed to save. But in the film, Max ends up getting captured by the people of this tyrant who calls himself Immortan Joe, and Immortan Joe's people actually worship him almost like a godlike figure. In the movie, you find out that Immortan Joe actually keeps these sex slaves, who he calls his wives, and he wants them to bear his children, and basically it's Immortan Joe's ultimate goal to have the perfect son. In the movie, this woman named Furiosa ends up helping Immortan Joe's wives escape from him, and she's looking for this place that may or may not exist called the Green Place. What ends up happening is Max meets Furiosa and the wives, and he ends up having to help them. But Immortan Joe finds out that his wives escaped from him, and now him and his armies are going after them. Now, Fury Road was freaking awesome. Once again, I loved the living hell out of this movie. And what I loved about the movie is, yes, there are some deeper themes in the film, but also the film is just a great action movie. Like, I would argue that this is probably the best action movie. I mean, it's a little early to say the best action movie of the decade, because we still have, like, what, 4 years left in this decade, but I mean, this is definitely, like, if I were to make a list of my top 10 favorite action movies, this would definitely be on that list. And what I really like about this film is I like how, for all intents and purposes, really the character of Furiosa is the main character in this movie. Max, I don't want to say he's a side character, but I would argue that both Max and Furiosa are almost like dual protagonists in this film. I also liked how this film kind of had the theme of redemption, because both Max and Furiosa feel as if they lost their humanity, and throughout the film you see both these characters slowly regain their humanity. Now, the movie is also visually breathtaking. Even if you don't like this movie at all, you can't deny that this is an extremely well-made movie. And what's really cool about this is it's mostly practical effects in this movie. There is some CGI, but what I like about it, though, is it's kind of a mix between both CGI and practical, which is kind of how it should be. And the CGI in this film is actually really well done. There's also a lot of dark humor in this movie, and there are a lot of really over-the-top things in this movie, but the old Mad Max movies had that too, but this kind of has it to the extreme. Now, the character of Furiosa is a freaking awesome character, and is a freaking badass character too. I also loved the character of Nux, the Nicholas Hoult character. He was a great character, and he actually went through a genuine arc within this movie. Like, in the beginning of the film, Nux is one of Immortan Joe's soldiers, and he absolutely worships Immortan Joe. Now, this character is the reason why I think hero worship is kind of a theme within this film. Because in the beginning of this film, you realize that Nux would do anything to please Immortan Joe, and there's even a part where, as Immortan Joe and his armies are going out into the desert looking for Furiosa, Nux is in his car and he turns to Immortan Joe saying, "Immortan Joe!" Like, trying to get Immortan Joe to look at him, and he does, and he freaks out with excitement that Immortan Joe actually looked at him. So that shows just how much Nux worships Immortan Joe, and how probably a lot of Immortan Joe's war boys worship him. But this character goes through a real arc in this movie, and he ends up failing right in front of Immortan Joe, and there's a point in this movie where you see him, like, curled up into a ball because he realized he failed in front of this man that he idolized, and it's only after that he starts to realize that, yeah, maybe this guy Immortan Joe is not as good as I thought he was, and, like, he starts to really turn over to Furiosa's side, even though Furiosa doesn't completely trust him in the beginning. And then, of course, you have the main villain of the movie, Immortan Joe, and Immortan Joe might actually be my favorite Mad Max villain, at least next to the character of Lord Humongous from The Road Warrior. And Immortan Joe is such an evil bastard, and he actually convinces his people that he is some kind of a god, so his people actually worship him almost like a godlike figure, and he even tells his soldiers that if they go out and die for him, he'll take their souls to Valhalla. So, like, he's just, like, such an evil bastard because he kinda uses belief as a way to manipulate and control people, but you almost get the idea that even Immortan Joe believes his own godlike status. Like, maybe Immortan Joe is so immersed in this mythology that he created that even he believes he is some kind of a god, which makes him even more dangerous. Now, in the movie, it's never stated for sure what Immortan Joe's backstory actually is, but you kind of get the implication that he might have actually have been a war colonel before the apocalypse happened, and for some reason, the character of Immortan Joe actually reminded me of a character from Robert McCammon's book, Swan Song, called Colonel Macklin. Like, the book Swan Song was a post-apocalyptic novel, and Colonel Macklin was this corrupt war colonel who ended up gathering survivors of the apocalypse to build his own army, and the character of Immortan Joe from this movie kind of reminds me a little bit of that character from the Robert McCammon novel. Now, as much as I did love this movie, there was one thing about this movie which did really bug me. And that's Max's age in the movie, because in the movie, Max even says in the beginning that he was a cop, so obviously he was alive before the apocalypse happened. Now, even assuming that this film is a pure reboot, not set in the same continuity as the first three movies, still, he says that he was a cop in the beginning of the movie, so that means he was obviously alive before the apocalypse happened. The problem with that is there are a lot of characters in this movie who clearly grew up in this environment. Like, you have the character of Furiosa, who you gotta figure was at least a little girl when the apocalypse happened. Like, she clearly grew up in this environment. The problem is, though, Furiosa really doesn't look that much younger than Max, and Max doesn't look that much older than Furiosa, yet Max was clearly alive before the apocalypse, and Furiosa was clearly grew up in this post-apocalyptic environment, so either the character of Max is supposed to be much older than he appears to be in the movie, or the character of Furiosa is supposed to be much younger than she appears to be. Now, there's actually a fan theory that might actually explain the issue of Max's age in the movie. The theory is that Max in this movie is not actually the same Max from the first three movies. Basically, the theory is that Max in this movie is actually the feral kid from The Road Warrior. Basically, the idea is that the feral kid would grow up to become the leader of that group of people that Max helped in The Road Warrior, and what happens is his people ended up getting attacked and killed, and after this, he kind of went crazy and ended up taking on the persona of Max, who was a man that he really looked up to and idolized, and the whole idea is that this is actually the feral kid assuming the role of Max. Also, in this movie, there are a lot of little references to The Road Warrior, but a lot of those little references are specifically feral kid references. Now, I'm not saying this fan theory about the feral kid is actually true, but at the same time, though, I do think it's really interesting, and something really interesting to think about. However, this movie did have a spin-off comic book series, and apparently that comic book series kinda contradicts the feral kid theory, but that also depends on whether or not you count the comic books as being canon or not. But once again, Mad Max Fury Road is an awesome movie. It's a great action movie, and it's a great post-apocalyptic movie, and it's a great addition to the Mad Max franchise. So, that was my review on Mad Max Fury Road, and bye.